Dit jaar wordt deze lezing verzorgd door de vooraanstaande Amerikaanse filosoof Ruth Millikan. Zij koos als onderwerp en als titel Mental Representations that are Physical with Darwin in the Lead. Darwin zonder hocus pocus dus. Voor zij die Ruth Millikan niet kennen, dat kan. Dan zal ik ook zeggen, voor zij die haar nog niet kennen, introduceer ik haar graag als een vooraanstaand Amerikaans filosoof met een academische carrière die zich eigenlijk uitstrekt van 1969 tot vandaag de dag. Zij is ook gespecialiseerd in de filosofie van de biologie, psychologie en taal. En tot aan haar emeritaat was ze verbonden aan de universiteit van Conneticut in de Verenigde Staten. Daarnaast is ze ook lid van de American Academy for Arts and Science en haar werk in de filosofie en de logica werd ook meermaals bekroond. Een heel grote madame dus. Vanavond zal ze trachten de menselijke geest, de kennis, op een naturalistische manier te verklaren. Dit wil daarmee zeggen in overeenstemming met de principes van de natuurwetenschappen en het materialistisch wetenschappelijk wereldbeeld. Opnieuw zonder hocus pocus. Maar ik ben hier niet expert ter zake. Ik ben Yazin, ik werk voor het Geuzenhuis. Dus voor u zich vragen vindt stellen van wat is zij allemaal aan het vertellen, laat ik eigenlijk graag professor Dr. Ruth Millikan aan het woord. Ruth, welcome tonight.
I'm here.
I'm here, you're here. Well,
yeah, okay, am I audible? You can hear me?
Yes, you're audible. I can hear you clearly.
You can hear me, yeah.
I'll leave the words to you. And then I'll mute myself. And good luck. And thank you for being with us here.
Okay. I thought I should start out by telling you why I'm qualified to give a Darwin lecture. My grandmother, this is my father's mother. She was born probably 1875, I think. She was born and she brought up on a farm in Montana, which was at that time, I mean, really, really far out. And somehow or other, she's a woman, remember, she believed in Darwinism. She just decided herself that he was right. And so that's where it began. As when she went to, the family went to the Philippine Islands, my father was brought up for the first 10 years of his life in the Philippines. And she taught there in Manila. And when she discovered that the children in her class fully believed the biblical story, that the way that woman had been made was by taking a rib from Adam. And so they all believed that men had one less rib than women. And she was so upset by this, being a naturalist, that she trotted those kids over to the local hospital, where at that time they had fluoroscopes. That was what they had, which would be sort of like our modern X-ray. But she trotted them over, and she stood one of the fluoroscope, and she had the kids count his ribs. So all right, so there's your naturalism. Also, on the other side of my family is my mother, and she was the first PhD in geology from the University of Minnesota, which was the big school at that time. This was around 1926. And her field was paleontology. And what that means is that she did her dissertation digging for fossils of shellfish that were, millions and millions of years old in the road cuts of Wisconsin. So she obviously believed in Darwinian evolution. She was studying these things. All right, so much. All right, it's going to be a while in this talk before I get to Darwin, but I will. All right. There's been a considerable controversy among neuroscientists recently about what kinds of representations. Actually, maybe the first slide could go up. Where will the slides appear? Is it Thomas in charge of slides? Yeah, okay. There's a considerable controversy among neuroscientists about what kinds of representations there are or might be in the brain. So there have been a lot of arguments about what it would be for something to be a representation. So it turns out that one neuroscientist will be doing an experiment and he'll say, oh, look, I found this. It must be a representation of such and such. And then another neuroscientist says, no, that's not what a representation is. You've got, here, I found one over here. This is what a representation is. So there was arguments about it. And so there was a call for papers, actually, just about 6 months ago, asking, yeah, here we are, thank you. It's a call for papers that will help us, this is the way it was put, to determine what representation means and what, yeah. So the neuroscientists won't then talk past one another when using this term. This is the call. So the work I'm gonna present, however, then was originally, at least the work that I did for it, was in a special issue of the journal Synthèse, which was asking for a discussion of what representation, the word representation, means. This question, this slide 2? Slide 2. This question, being asked by a scientist, is similar to a question that has been debated over the last 40 years by people in the philosophy of mind. That is the question that's been talked about a lot. Is it possible, as the philosophers put it, is it possible to naturalize intentionality? Now, intentionality is the ofness or aboutness, say, of a sentence to the thing it's about, or a picture to the thing it's about. It's ofness or aboutness. So the question was whether or not, where this seems really difficult is if you think, how does your thought of something, how is it connected to what it's a thought of? And can you actually give a naturalized analysis of that? So thoughts do seem to be, I mean, people have thought that thoughts were something like representations of things. So the question was, can we explain what a representation is in a way that's completely natural and such that it would make sense to suppose that there are neural representations in the brain that were helping them. So you might think of it this way. The question was, can we chase the ghost out of the mind machine, for the ghost of the machine, right? All right, so how would you try to go about answering such a question? Well, one possibility would be to start by asking whether there are properties common and peculiar, say, to all, or at least to a dominant proportion, of the common things that we actually call representations in ordinary life. The things that we would say represent something else. And if so, we could ask whether or not things of that kind might be found in the brain, so that looking for them might be helpful for the progress of neuroscience. So this is a really broad question. If you see, is there anything interesting that's common, say, to indicative sentences of many kinds, along with maps, charts, diagrams, graphs, road signs that say when the crossroad is coming up, right? Bee dances, which have interested people because they seem to be telling where the nectar is. Oh, it seemed to be representations of the direction the fellow bees are supposed to fly. Say mating dances that seem to represent when the animal dancing wants to mate. How about animals' danger signals, right? And even such things as labels on bottles, right? They represent what's in the bottle somehow or other. So the question is there actually anything in common among all of those things? If so, the hope would be that no special or technical meaning for representation would need to be fashioned for it to naturally and fruitfully be used in the neurosciences. All right, this for me goes back a very long way. In 1984, really, I offered support for a proposal that there are natural properties that are common and peculiar to most of the ordinary things that we call representations, and that make them be representations. And I've actually recently come back to that a little bit in the last year. I've done a little more work on that. So here what I'd like to do is, and I should say that what I actually did there was to try to look, was actually to try, it was a long book, to try to explain this, that there really was a sense in which maps, charts, diagrams, graphs, signs, bee dances, mating dances, in which all of these things had something in common, so that it was sensible, that one could call it by the same name. All right, so here what I would like to do is to compare, I can't tell, I can't tell what screen that is. It doesn't say its number, but we need number 4. All right. All right, that's all right. That'll be all right. I'll come to that. All right. What I've tried to do is to compare the results that I argued for there, that was way back in 84, in that earlier study. And of course, I did it by a philosopher's methods, by just sitting and thinking about these things, turning them over and trying to see what they had in common. It was all very, very unempirical. I used no laboratory. So I had the results and what I thought a representation would be. And I thought it would be interesting to compare those results with contemporary views that have been coming here and there from people in the cognitive sciences or in the neurosciences. What's interesting is that what I've discovered is that these views, I mean, my view, which was derived in a purely philosopher's way, and the views that we're seeing now show a surprising convergence. And so I thought it was interesting to that I would sort of lay out for you maybe what the question is and how one might answer that sort of in a way that would make sense for a neuroscientist. And that the fact that there was a convergence between the properties that I suggested and at least what seems to be coming to the fore now in the actual literature in neuroscience was a kind of evidence maybe for the soundness of the position. So, all right. Sorry. So I argued, this is at 84, that representation was primarily what one might call a function term. I'll explain what a function term is. It's best explained by giving an example, so I'm going to use a typewriter as an example. All right, suppose that in preparation for shipping a pile of scrap metal, you see, when you ship scrap metal, you have to crunch it all together, right? So it takes up less space, right? So that in preparation for shipping a pile of scrap metal, suppose that the crunching machine happens to crunch various little bits of this and that together so as to form an object precisely like a 1940s Underwood typewriter, except one that had been run over by a truck. I was brought up with the 1940s Underwood typewriter. Beside it on the scrap pile, let's suppose there exists another object, and the other object actually identical. It's identical in every way, but it was formed by a truck running over a 1940s Underwood typewriter, right? That's actually how it came to be. All right, the scrap, that later scrap, right, is obviously a badly smashed typewriter. It's a typewriter, but it's badly smashed. The other object is not a typewriter at all. It's exactly like a badly smashed typewriter, but it's not a typewriter. All right, I say that analysis accords with the analysis you're looking at there, the American Heritage Online Dictionary and other dictionaries. They say that what a typewriter is a machine that is for producing alphabetic characters, numerals, typographical symbols, one at a time on paper inserted around a roller. It's not, notice, a typewriter, just a machine with keys that does produce alphabetic characters, right? Nor is it just a machine with keys that could produce alphabetic characters, right? It's a machine with keys for producing alphabetic characters. All right, so what the dictionary is telling us is that the term typewriter is used for things that have keys for producing alphabetic characters, whether or not they are actually capable of doing this. What it is that makes a typewriter a function term, say a function, is the function is like its purpose. It's what makes a typewriter a function term is that it's defined by its purpose, right? Whether or not a thing has a function and what that function is makes an extremely important difference, actually. So function terms are extremely interesting for this reason. If something has a function, then that function, what that function is, will determine whether that thing can be evaluated as a good one or a bad one, an excellent one, a correct one, a defective one, a poor one, one that's not working, one that's incorrect, so that the evaluation, the standard against which the thing can be, there is a standard against which the thing can be measured. That is, the standard is whether and how well it can perform its function, what it's for. So unless the thing is taken to have a function, a purpose, in Greek we say a telos, there is no standard for that kind of evaluation. Is slide 6 there, Thomas? Which I'm not sure what. Yeah, okay. All right, back to representations. Enter, as I said, Twilio Semantics, or it's now called Twilio Semantics. At the time when people originally talking this way, back in the early 80s, it didn't have this term, but it's a nice term. The teleo, of course, is for telos, purpose, the Greek word telos, teleosemantics. All right, so the claim of teleosemantics was that representation is a function term. So that it must be defined, what makes something a representation is defined by what it is designed to do and how, right? The reason for thinking that was that if representations were not things that were for something, there wouldn't be any standard of reference by which representations would be correct or incorrect, true, false, fulfilled, unfulfilled. So it seems as though whatever else the representation is, that it's something that has a function. So then the question would be, what is it? What is the function of a representation? How does it perform it? All right, so let me stop here for a moment just to mention. So our problem here is going to be to explain what it is for a representation to be for something, and we're thinking about representations in the brain primarily here. What would it be for them to be for something, such that they could do it wrong or rightly, do it rightly or wrongly? And it's Darwin, actually, who enabled us to begin to answer a question like that. He had a very, very new idea, and that he thought, after Darwin's principle of natural selection, it gave you something that could be a standard. What was the thing selected for? So what was the thing selected for is one question. What can it actually do may be another question. Think of the heart, of course. We assume that the heart was selected for pumping blood, but there are people who have defective hearts that don't pump blood, or that don't do it well. But the fact that we can say it's a bad heart, or it's a damaged heart, is because we have an idea of what it was for. And that Darwin said, what that is what it was selected for. So he said, there's the purposes of this guy. That's the purpose of the heart. So there's a sense in which the purposes of that kind, there's nothing unnatural about them. There's nothing just purely mental about them or something. You can understand what a purpose is in a perfectly natural way, just as what the thing was selected for doing. Right. So that's where Darwin comes in. So he's very, very important to what got called teleosemantics. All right, actually, this was my way of putting that question in 1984. I said, I guess this is clear enough. If language device tokens and mental intentional states, that is states like believing or intending or hoping that, if those are members of function categories, then they are language devices or intentional states, not by virtue of not by virtue of their actual powers, right? But by virtue of what they are supposed to be able to do, yet perhaps cannot do. For example, just as hearts and kidneys are sometimes diseased or malformed, so sentences and beliefs are sometimes false. Words and concepts are sometimes ambiguous, sometimes vacuous. So such sentences, beliefs, words, concepts are unable to perform their functions. This was the analysis that was attempted then. So let us think of a representation as something that was designed by evolution, presumably as the brain, to perform certain functions, or the thing that made the representation in the brain was designed to make things that would perform in a certain way. So all right, so that was the beginning of Twilio Semantics, was just that kind of thought. And so notice that Twilio Semantics, if that's what it is, it just says, look, what's important is to try to find out the function. It's got to be that if they're mental representations, that they've got a function that what's going to make them representations. Simply as such, Twilio Semantics doesn't tell you what the function of a representation is, nor does it tell about how a representation carries out that function, like the typewriter by pushing the keys, right? So despite, as a matter of fact, there has been considerable confusion on this matter among philosophers about this, but as a matter of fact, basic Twilio Semantics says nothing whatsoever about, say, the content of a representation, how that is determined, what the representation is determined, what the representation does, what makes it a representation, really. It doesn't say anything except that, well, it must be something with a function. And if something in the brain's got a function, it's got to be because that's something it was designed to do. And of course, most modern people, most people in the sciences certainly today, would assume that means that it was a result of natural selection. Take up Darwin's principle. All right, so once clearly articulated and correctly understood, it seems to me that the teleosemantic move is perfectly harmless. Indeed, it's hardly disputable if you believe in natural selection, if you are a naturalist, a Darwinist, it seems that. All right, consider the reflection, say, of trees in calm waters. That reflection can yield all kinds of information about those trees. So it gives you lots of information, just the way language or photograph might, right? Yet when the ripples distort the information, when the wind blows and that information is distorted, the reflection does not suddenly misrepresent. Right? Reflections don't misrepresent. Simply as a reflection, it doesn't have a function. So it can't fail to perform that function. So contrast with it then conventional representations like linguistic representations, say. They are artifacts with conventional symbiotic functions. Symbiotic means that they're designed to help a hearer and a speaker and a hearer to do something together, right? That helps both of them. All right, so I suppose that the kind of basic function we might say of basic language, say, is that of, say, passing information from speakers to hearers. But if they're not formed in the right way, of course, say sentences, will be unable to perform that function, but instead they will, and we say, misrepresent. The water with the wind blowing on it doesn't misrepresent, even though even though if you took it to be representing, you would think that the trees you were looking at in the reflection were doing some very strange things, but it's not trying to represent. It's not a representation. All right, so if there are mental representations, then they would seem to have a function or purpose. Yes, this is the idea anyway, at least in the sense that the heart has a function or a purpose. They must be capable, and that would be why they are capable of misrepresenting. All right, I don't know what screen it is. Have we gone through 7? Or is that 7, Thomas? Could you put on 7? Is that 7? Yeah, all right, so I've just said this. Twilio Semantics is the very beginning. But all right, here. All right. Now, I think that if it had been understood correctly, that the teleosemantic move should have neatly divided the ongoing quest for representations into 2 independent parts. For first, there is the question what it is to have a function in the first place, in an appropriate sense. Second, there's the question what determines that this or that kind of thing has a function and the function that it has. Specifically, what determines the function, the telos of this or that sort of representation, and how does it acquire that function? 9, thank you, would be, the second question divides in 2. What is the specific function of a representation as such? The function that is required of it for it to be a representation at all. We know what function something has to have to be a typewriter. So what function does something have to be a representation? Right. What is the job of a representation? What is its particular method? Second, this is a second question. What is its particular method, if any, by which a good undamaged representation performs its function? I mean, the typewriter does this by your pushing on keys. It has a method. So the question is then, is there a particular way, a particular kind of mechanism by which a representation serves its function that makes it be a representation? Slide 10. All right. So the first question, as I think I've already said, was answered, at least by people in the sciences and by most philosophers. Most of those who adopted the teleosemantic position assumed that a thing's function was what it had been doing, what it had been designed to select it from doing. Thank you, Darwin. So it was Darwin that allowed this initial very important move, and that is to stop. I mean, there really had been problems before. People would say, well, representations do this and this and this and something else. And then the question would be, yeah, that's lovely. But what if it's false? Why is it a representation if it doesn't do that? Because a false representation won't do what a true one does, presumably. So what is it to be a representation that's not doing its job? And Darwin was the one that gave us the answer, at least the answer that was taken by teleosemanticists and by myself, right? If there are representations in the brain, the thought was they must have been produced by mechanisms that were selected, at least by natural selection, for producing representations. The body, after all, is filled, your body is filled with hundreds and thousands of the most intricate and clever mechanisms that no Darwinian would doubt were there owing to natural selection. I mean, the incredible, people who look at the minute things that happen in your body that seem to be purposefully there and that are required for your metabolism to go as it does, et cetera, et cetera. It's just amazing, the complexity of the body and how many things are in there that obviously have functions. And the assumption is that they all over the eons, of course, are there because they were not selected out. That's the way to put it. Because they were not selected out. Because they were making animals who had them better off than those that didn't. All right, 11. All right. So there was little or no attempt. I mean, the philosophers and the people in cognitive science who were thinking about this, there wasn't any attempt, any systematic attempt, however, to answer the second question. Everyone was kind of agreed on the first, but there weren't any theories that were offered simply about the defining functions of representations generally, or about the way they perform their functions, if there is a way that makes them representations, if they have to perform their functions. So a number of highly simplistic competing theories concerning the nature of an inner or mental representation were suggested by philosophers, as mostly found wanting. But those experiments were often taken to be tests of teleosemantics itself. They were not. What they really were tests of many theories of representational function. That's what they actually were, and those many theories, that one after another, they were shown to be wrong. But there have been no arguments that I know of, either for or against teleosemantics itself. Teleosemantics being the position that representations are functions. And so if you want to know what a representation is, you got to ask what its function is. Right? So as far as I know, there have been no arguments for or against, except the original argument for teleosemantics, that it must be right if there is to be such a thing as misrepresentation. Philosophers may recognize that as the title of a famous essay by Fredresky about that time. Somebody saying, oh, look, the problem is we don't know what a misrepresentation is. All right. How then should one go about answering the question, what is the function of a representation as a representation? So the term representation, for instance, might turn out to be hopelessly equivocal, either at the center or around the edges. But it seems that we could discover this only by actually looking very carefully to see if the bulk of things we would unreflectively call representations either do or don't, in fact, have a common function, and whether they have a common way of performing that function. All right, done the right way, the big job. It would mean carefully comparing, as I said, maps, graphs, diagrams, informative sentences, road signs, certain kinds of gestures, railroad crossing signs, animal danger signals, etc. All right. Should we find a function and a way of performing it common to these, then we could go on to ask what evidence there might be that there are things in the brain that perform that kind of function in that kind of way. Right? But that sounds like a very iffy project. All right. That was actually what I tried to do way back in 1984, was to show that there was something common. And I wasn't thinking about neurology at that time at all. I didn't know very much about it at all at that time. I've learned quite a lot more. But I was actually trying to see if we couldn't find something that was in common to the various things that we would sort of naturally say represent something, right? All right, so the purpose here then is I'm trying to compare the things that I've tried to argue were in common and to all kinds of different things that we call function. The basic things, trying to compare that to what's coming forward in neuroscience now, and seeing quite a considerable convergence, which makes me happy, of course. It seems to me that might be a bit of evidence that there's something to this. So I want to compare the results. Then what I'm going to do here is to compare the results of my studies earlier with influential contemporary views on representations in the brain. All right, slide 12. So if representation is primarily a function term, right? The leading question that needs to be answered seems to be, what are representations for? All right, what is their purpose? What are they for? What's their function? What do they do when they're performing as designed? So like a typewriter or an axe, presumably they are designed to be used. Thus, the central claim, actually the central claim of a book by William Ramsey that came out just in 2007, not that long ago, it's a very foundational book in which he was criticizing the way in which the term representation is used, particularly in the neurosciences. And he ended up in a way with empty hands. He said he couldn't, there didn't seem to be anything that could be said. But what he did say was that nothing, this is a very famous book of his that was called Representations Reconsidered. Right? The one thing that he wanted to insist on was that an entity couldn't qualify as a representation unless it was used as a representation, like a type, something's not a typewriter unless it's designed to be used for something, for exactly printing letters, et cetera, as the definition said. Right? So the question is then, what is it for a representation to be used as a representation? Used by what? For what? And Ramsey didn't answer those questions. But I think that we can begin to answer those questions. So the first question then is, all right, what is a represent used for? It's used for what? And it turns out that it may not be so difficult to give a very vague answer to that. However, I think a fairly important part of an answer. Slide, is it the next slide, 13, Thomas? See what's there, see what 13 is. All right, yeah, okay, a very abstract answer. That a representation is for use by some kind of interpreter. When anything that makes representations makes it for something to use it, for it to inform something, to do something like informing something else, right? So a representation is for use by some kind of interpreter, that is, by something that uses it as a representation and performing some function that it has. That's a very, very slender beginning. But it offers this much to the neuroscientists looking for representations, and this is actually quite an important beginning, I think. It's what it says is that a representation in the brain would have to be used as such by some other part or aspect of the brain, or by something connected to the brain. So if there are representations in the brain, you've got to find, if you find representations, there've also got to be interpreters. So if you think you found a representation in the brain, then you better look and try to see what the interpreter is. Because if there's no interpreter for that representation, it's not a representation. It's just accidentally like something, maybe. So for the simplest sort of example, and this comes actually directly from the neurosciences, a reliable coincidence between certain neuronal activity in the visual system, say, and something before the eyes. Those of you who know about this, say, edge detect, the going off of an edge detector, which happens pretty much almost in the retina of the eye. A reliable coincidence between certain neuronal activity in the visual system and something that's before the eyes that appears to be the cause, that's not yet evidence that the former is a representation of the latter. And that's very interesting because a great many people in neuroscience had assumed that that was all you had to show. All you had to show that something was a representation was that it was uniformly pretty much caused by something external. it would need to be shown to show that it was a representation that some part of the brain uses or reacts to that neuronal activity as a representation of that something's presence before the eyes. But that now requires us, of course, to face the question, the difficult question, and that is, what is it to use a representation as a representation? What is that interpreter supposed to do? How do we know it's an interpreter? What is an interpreter? It's not just something that's jarred by a representation. It apparently uses it. So the question is, what is it to use a representation as a representation in the performance of some function? All right, so if there are representations, there must be interpreters for them. And that doesn't have to be taken narrowly. I think it's important. Mental representation and terminal interpreters, might be extremely complex systems involving large neural networks. Representation interpreters might use various mental representations together, say in performing inferences. A representation in the brain also might have many potential interpreters, many things that might use it if they needed it. Different uses. The representation might have different uses. You might have different uses for the representation of a certain thing on different occasions. So I give as an example, for instance, suppose that you're walking along, you're hiking and you're walking along the path and suddenly in front of you, you see an empty beer can. All right. Now, the sight of that empty beer can could guide you where you see it, how you see it, that where you see it could guide you in stepping over it. It's one thing. Or you might pick it up with your hands, or you might pick it up with a stick, right? Or you might kick it along the trail into the woods, or you might step on it, or you might point to it, or you might just consider the character of the person who left it, and so forth. So when we talk about an interpreter, there might be many interpreters, and there also might be interpreters that have different settings that will use the same kind of representation in different ways on different occasions. So we're not thinking of sort of one representation, it's just one interpreter sitting there just waiting for that representation. All right. Supposing that mental representations, supposing that beliefs are mental representations, which has been, there's something like mental representations, which has been an assumption in the back of cognitive scientists' minds, of course. Suppose that beliefs are mental representations. A single belief, think of this, a really simple, an obvious belief, such as that animals can drown in water. This is something you know. Or that it's later in the day than at night, right? A belief like that can be used to advantage in different ways during your lifetime, hundreds and hundreds of times, right? So also, it's not like a representation is something necessarily that comes and goes either. I mean, sometimes, presumably in the case of some beliefs, they're permanent and they may get used by different interpreters in different ways on different occasions for different reasons. So, all right. So what is it then? Our last question then is the really biggest to be the really difficult one, I think. What was really puzzling. What then is it for an interpreter to use a representation as a representation? Say, as I said, a typewriter might be used as a rather blunt weapon, but it was not being used as a typewriter, right? So a pretty standard contemporary answer from the cognitive sciences is that a neural representation would be, and this is what's pretty commonly said, something that guides behavior or that plays a role in controlling actions. These are statements that you see quite commonly, something like that in the neuroscience literature, now in the cognitive science literature. All right. All right, something that guides behavior or that plays a role in controlling actions. The rest is important. When performing tasks that require taking account of that which is represented. So have that up. It's the last part that's extremely important. That in order to perform the task, you have to somehow or other take account of, or you have to move differently, or do something a certain way in order to take account of the fact that's being represented here. Where the stone is, where the beer can is, where the rock is that you're going to step over. You have to your representation of the rock, the perceptual representation of the rock, for instance, seems like what it does. I mean, what sort of obviously does is to guide you in taking account of the fact that there's a rock in front of you, so you don't trip over it. That's right. All right. The behavior or action of what? See, as I say, the cog scientists are saying something that guides behavior, that plays a role in controlling actions, etc. The behavior or action of what? Well, I say the behavior or action of the whole animal is what seems to be meant by the cognitive scientists. After all, that's what they eventually would like to explain. But many things besides external behaviors are controlled by the brain. Many things that go on in the rest of the brain are controlled by other parts of the brain. Many things that go on in the rest of the body are controlled by parts of the brain. Many things that go on in the brain itself have to be synchronized. Feature detection, say, detectors help to instigate deeper perception, not just to control behavior. Inferences and other transitions of one mental state to another seem to occur, so that it's not just external behavior, right? So surely I want to say the question is open, whether or not some, or I would imagine a lot, of that work of the brain organizing itself, the various parts of the brain talking to each other, right? Whether or not that work is done, a lot of that work anyway, is done using methods that work on the same principle as do methods of controlling external behaviors. In other words, whether or not, why should we think of representations only as adapting the organism to something external? It seems to be quite clear that there may be lots of representations that are adapting one part of the body to what's happening in another part of the body, right? All right. And it's easy enough, I would say, to generalize, if that's the case. Let's say every representation, every kind of representation, including a neural representation, would be, its function would be guiding the behavior or operation of another mechanism or other mechanisms, interpreters, that have functions where these functions can be performed successfully only if their activities are set or molded to fit or to take account of the state of affairs that is represented, whether that's a state of affairs in another part of the body or in the external world. It would be the same thing, right? So representations then are used by their interpreters for guidance in performing actions and performing functions, which are functions of the interpreter. So the interpreter is something that needs to use the representation. The typewriter, what does it do? Well, it helps you, the person typing. Its only function is to be an aid to you. So the function of the representation then is to be an aid to something trying to do something that needs to be guided by what the representation is saying. There. So if the representation is correct, an interpreter can perform a certain task or tasks of its own by using or being adjusted by the representation, such as to take account of the represented state of affairs. that the representation is correct and that it actually fits what it's supposed to be representing will then be part of a causal explanation of how the interpreter manages to perform that function. So here we certainly have a very naturalized vision of what a representation or in the brain might be, or what say in the end something like a belief might unpack into. All right, finally, 15, slide 15. Finally, we should ask whether or not representations have a common way of functioning. That's, say, as typewriters have keys to be struck, right? And there again, it seems to me that there is a consensus which is slowly emerging among people, in particularly cognitive science, I would say. I think maybe the best known statement of this comes from Randy Gallistell in 1990. It was quite a long time ago. Randy Gallistell, he's an animal behavior person, but I should say, what is he? He's an animal neurologist. He tries to understand how the brains of animals work. He said he's very good. All right, this is what Randy said in 1990. He said, a representation in psychology is a functioning isomorphism between processes within the brain or mind and an aspect of the environment to which those processes adapt the animal's behavior. All right. There you have it on the yeah. All right, I'm going to read you my own statement of that position from 1984. Of what this is just a general statement about representation, about what a representation is. All right. A representation was such that there are operations upon or transformations in the mathematical sense, not physically changing, but a mathematical kind of changing, if it were like this instead of that. There are operations upon or transformations in the mathematical sense of the representation that correspond one-to-one to operations upon or transformations of the represented, such that any transformation of the representation that results from one of those operations has, as a normal condition for its proper performance, the corresponding transform of the representation. So I need to give you some kind of vaguely concrete example of that, but this is what Randy and I both had in mind. Suppose you have a map. I mean, a map is the most obvious sort of representation. It's so easy to see this happening there. Suppose on a map, you've got London at a certain place on the map, and you move that little dot for London up a half a centimeter. Move up a half a centimeter. Well, it may be, given the mapping that you're using, mapping system that you're using, that would correspond to moving London a kilometer north. So doing something, if you changed where the dot was on the map, that it would represent something different in the world, and it would represent that London was in a different place. I mean, that's a very, very simple example. Take an example from language, really simple example. So you've got the sentence, John loves Mary. Oh, let's make it perform a transformation. Let's swap the subject and the predicate. And we get Mary loves John. What do we have to do to change the world to correspond to that? If you change John loves Mary to Mary loves John, that would correspond to changing the world such that it was Jane who loved John, right? Just flopping those two. So you see the correspondence there. Another example where it's not maybe so obvious. Suppose you have a graph which shows the weight of each child in the kindergarten, right? and you take the little graph line, this is a bar graph, you know. You take the little graph line that corresponds to Johnny, and you make it a centimeter longer. Well, in order to keep fitting the world, you're going to have to make Johnny, did I say Johnny? A pound heavier. So it might be that increasing the length of the bar for Johnny would correspond to increasing the weight of Johnny. So there's kind of a mapping here. So, and now that kind of transformations, of course, can be extremely complicated. And there can be many, something can be transformed maybe in many, many dimensions sometimes. So, but that's a very simple example of the principle here. All right, so representing then requires, are we at 16? Yeah, I guess we are. We have been, thank you, Thomas. Representing then, according to Randy and me, and I think people, quite a few people are beginning to say this, right? It requires an isomorphism. Actually, technically it's a homomorphism, but between the set of representations in a system and the set of things that they represent, such that an interpreter mechanism or mechanisms could use the representation to adapt its ways of functioning to that which is represented as required to perform certain of its own functions, certain of the interpreter's functions. So, right, so to be guided by certain aspects, by a certain aspect or aspects of the form of the representation is then equivalent to being guided by a certain aspect or aspects of the represented, of the environment, of whatever is represented. So considering the form of representation, the values of its significant variable, considering that the form of representation equals the values of its significant variables, that's determined as a function of the form of its represented. It is not mysterious that the representation's form might help to guide an activity that requires taking account of the form of the represented. Right. So, all right, an example that I used at one time that's not quite of a representation, but it gives the same idea. My sister, older sister, used to have a typewriter, a sewing machine years ago that would actually make certain kinds of designs, like make a flower or a rabbit or something. And it did this by your putting a little cam. What a cam, you know, is a it's an irregularly shaped, generally a flat thing, a flat piece of metal usually that's irregularly shaped, and it turns around, and this irregular shape then pushes, you know, controls something else, which pushes in and out. All right, so this typewriter had, this sewing machine had cams, and you stick one cam in, and then you put your foot on the pedal of the sewing machine, and out would come a rabbit. You put another one in, and out would come a squirrel. Right? All right. Now, how was that done? It was done because there had to be an isomorphism somehow or other between the a very complicated, probably, isomorphism between the various forms that the cams could take and the various forms that would be turned out by the machine. So, all right. All right, so the use of representation then, I really want to say what it is really is an engineering principle. If you think, it's an engineering principle, like the use of levers or gears. So there's nothing mysterious about it. So if, considering that the form of a representation sets, that is, the values of its significant variables, the things that could be transformed. If the form of the representation, that is, the values of its significant variables, if that's determined as a function of the form of what is represented, which is what happens with the homomorphism, it is not mysterious at all, right? That the representation's form might help to guide an activity that requires taking account of the form of that which is represented. All right, so that's the basic idea. All right. Now, I could stop there, Thomas, or I could go on there. One more interesting thing that I didn't really have to, but I just thought was kind of interesting that I could. But maybe it's time that we should.
Well, you can go ahead.
You want me to go ahead? All right, it's quick. I just think it's interesting. Too. All right, a homomorphism, technically in mathematics, it holds between two sets, not two individuals. Right? Every representation as such is one of a set of possible representations that represent different alternatives. Right? They are alternatives, possible states of affairs. Right? All right, those form a network such that certain mathematical operations that would transform one representation in the system into another, in that system they are paired with operations that would transform what the first represents into what the second represents. It follows that there's a rule by which the representation in a system in which they determine their representatives. Next slide. That's all right, we'll go ahead. Like a sentence, then, a representation has to be articulate. The articulation of a representation is determined by the kinds of transformations that would transform one representation in the system into another representation in the same system. Each feature of a representation that would produce a different representation if transformed is a variable. And what remains unchanged under every transformation is the invariant of the representational system. Thus, it seems that every representation must have at least two significant parts or aspects. Think of it this way. A word is not a representation. It doesn't tell you anything. Somebody says dog. What do you learn? You don't learn anything. A sentence, a full sentence, my dog is brown, right? Tells you something. And it needs more than one word to actually say anything. And it needs more than one, it needs some structure in order for something to be a representation. But that means that, can we have the next slide? Because this is the one, I guess, the next slide, Tom, and yeah, here we are. So every representation then must have at least two significant parts, right? It's got to be something that you can change significantly in some way. So it's got to have an invariant, and it's got to have at least one variant. All right, so then we say, well, think of a stop sign. Does that have two significant parts? I mean, it definitely seems to represent a place you're supposed to stop, right? Somebody else, help! It's obviously supposed to represent something, right? Represent a person who's in trouble. The dinner bell, right? It rings at a time. It doesn't seem to be articulate. What kinds of transformations are possible here that would make it mean something else? There's come on, but it represents dinner bells. It tells you when dinner is. So surely it represents something. All right. The reason that these signs do not appear to be articulate, and this I think is really very, very interesting. They don't appear to have any features that, if they were changed, would yield a different meaning, right? Seems like there's nothing you could change to yield a different meaning. They don't appear to be part of a projectable representational system in which something else might have been said instead. They're saying it's a representational system. Every representational should be in a system where there are other representations in that system that would have said something different, right? But I want to say that appearance is mistaken, that there aren't anything you can change that would make a different representation. The difficulty here is that to see the system in these very simple cases requires adopting an interesting but very unusual perspective from which time and or place are seen not merely of the context of the representation, which would be a kind of a natural way to look at it. They're seen not as part of the context of the representation, but actually as significant variables within the representation. So the time and place are part of the representation. Then if the time or the place changes, something has changed in the representation, and what is meant is changed. All right, second thing. In order to understand those things as representations requires interpreting those variables, time and place, as self signs. The place stands for itself. You have a stop sign. Tells you where to stop. Where? Well, where the stop sign is. The place of the stop sign represents what? The place of the stopping. It represents itself. Same thing. Red light. The time of the red light represents the time you're supposed to stop. Right? Different time, different stop. You know, it comes on at a different time. It represents something different. It represents that you're supposed to stop at a different time. The time it stops, the time it comes on represents the time you're supposed to stop. Right. So I could go on because there have been in neuroscience there have been some questions about representations of this kind, you know, not wanting to treat them as representations, and people signals, etc., not wanting to treat them as representations. So I want to argue that, as a matter of fact, if you're careful, they, as a matter of fact, do have the form of representations, and it's probably important to notice that. Okay, I'm done.
Wow, thank you a lot. I'm unmuted now, so I can really speak again. Thank you, Ruth. That was really interesting. It was quite a lot.